Okay, Kristen.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to the January 8th edition of StockTalk. My name is Kristen Bouchard-Teasdale. I'm the Livestock and Forage Extension Specialist out of the Beausejour office, and I will be your host. On behalf of Manitoba Agriculture's livestock and forage production staff, I would like to take the time to wish Manitoba's beef producers a healthy, safe, and successful year ahead. Thank you for all you do for your cattle, your land, and our industry. We hope 2026 brings good weather, healthy calves, strong forage growth, and a rewarding grazing and production system. All the best in 2026. We look forward to working with you again this year. On today's agenda, we'll first take a quick look at some programming updates, followed by a presentation on annual forages for beef cattle grazing with Dr. Emma McHugh, Associate Professor of Sustainable Grasslands and Livestock Production Systems from the University of Manitoba. We've got Emma at the top there. So, hi, Em. We're so excited that you're joining us today. And we'll round out the webinar with a Chewing the Cud session where we'll be joined by our provincial beef specialist, Dr. Juanita Kopp. Okay, so on with the updates. The Manitoba Forage and Livestock team is conducting a winter feed and water survey. Those choosing to participate can submit a forage sample for basic testing to central labs at a cost of $71. They will then receive a complimentary trace mineral analysis of that forage sample. So those would include minerals such as copper, zinc, manganese, as well as molybdenum, and we added sulfur in there too, and a complimentary analysis of your primary winter water source, which will be sent to ALS testing in Winnipeg. To participate in the water survey, please contact the number on the screen, and limited spots are available in each region. We have some exciting things happening next week. Beef and Forage Days meetings will kick off on January 13th. Tuesday in Eriksdale, followed by Austin on January 14th and Roblin on January 15th. We've got a great agenda this year featuring Megan Westfall, our soil specialist in Manitoba Agriculture, doing a presentation on digging deeper, assessing soil health in Manitoba, a cattle market update and outlook with Rick Wright, a presentation from Christine O'Reilly, a forage and grazing specialist out of Ontario. Her lecture will be From Grass to Graze, Getting the Most from Every Mouthful. And we'll also be joined by Dr. Colin Palmer from the Western College of Veterinary Medicine. And he will be chatting about beyond the breeding soundness exam, understanding bull subfertility in the herd. So if you're planning to participate in the Eriksdale and Roblin meetings, please give a call to the number on the screen to pre-register in advance. We want to make sure that we've got enough food for everyone. And if you're in Austin, the event is such a well-oiled machine. They've got a pretty great idea of numbers, and they've got their catering figured out. For those who don't have a meeting happening in their location, the Eriksdale meeting will be broadcasted over Zoom. And you know what? I'm not quite sure how we get that to people. I would say look on the Livestock Landing or webpage with Manitoba Agriculture, and there should be information about the link for the Zoom meeting at that time. As cover crop use in Ontario and the prairies continues to evolve, a survey is being launched to capture insights into that change. It is a collaborative project led by researchers from the University of Manitoba and Manitoba Agriculture alongside the Ontario Cover Crop Steering Committee, which aims to build on 2020's survey and learn more about the adoption practices, benefits, and challenges of cover crops as reported by farmers and their advisors. This year's survey is open to all farm types and sizes, and those who advise farms across Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The survey can be accessed by scanning the QR code on the screen, and it is open until March 31st, 2025. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the reins to Emma for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Kristen.
I think I need to be able to share if you
Okay,
can
stop
unshare
share.
yours.
There we go.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. All right. You can see my full screen, Kristen, I think, hopefully.
I can. Yeah, looks good.
Okay, awesome. Okay. I just want to say thank you very much to Kristen and to Manitoba Agriculture for the invitation to speak with everybody today. It's always a pleasure to be able to do these. I'm going to talk a little bit for the next 30 minutes about use of annual forages for beef cattle grazing. So I will summarize some of the work that we are doing here at the U of M on some ongoing projects and just some of the considerations and thoughts that are around the use of annual forages for cattle. So hopefully if I'm gonna get my slides to work. Okay, so some of the things we're going to just chat about really quickly this morning. Extended grazing, where we see probably the most important role for annual crops or forages for cattle grazing is potentially in the fall and winter. When we think about good grass management in the spring and in the summer, that probably really is the most economical way to feed the herd. So when we think about potentially the greatest opportunity for the use of annual crops or forages is in that late summer, fall, winter period, or as potential rescue crops if we see crop failure during the grazing season. We'll talk a little bit about considerations. I'll touch on and give some sort of high level results from some of the corn intercropping work that we've been doing here at the U of M and with partners across Western Canada. Um, we'll talk about annual forage intercropping and some of the grazing considerations. Kristen has mentioned feed testing, and it was quite appropriate. I will talk a little bit about that. It was a really critical component of not just the use of annual crops, but the use any feeding strategy that we have for cattle. So it won't be news to anybody here on the call that overwinter feeding is a very significant cost, about two-thirds of the costs associated with cow-calf production here in Western Canada. So again, we want to try and explore the potential for using annual crops and forage, not just in terms of the yield or the amount of feed that they can provide, but also looking at the quality of them and whether they're utilized as grazed forage, as swathed feed, or as in sile, so use as conserved feed. So when we think about extended grazing, again, won't be news to anybody here, but overall reduce costs compared to confinement feeding. Um, Return and distribution of nutrients and organic matter through the manure in the soil. And, based on water and shelter, there may be some flexibility of the location. However, things like considering nutrition. So we really want to think about the feed test. We'll talk a little bit about potential metabolic disorders that could be risk factors that we want to try and manage. They won't always be totally prohibitive, but can we manage them? So just looking at a Canfax survey, again, probably won't be news to everybody, but just looking, Canada-wide and in here specifically in Manitoba, what percentage of beef operations graze or feed their cattle an open field or pasture from November onwards. So we're sitting a little bit lower in the last couple of years compared to 2017, but still around that two-thirds of those surveyed did utilize some form of grazing in that late fall and overwinter period. So again, when we think about opportunities, how can we target the use of annual crops, for example, to fit into that grazing window? So, annual crops are not necessarily going to work on every operation and very much, the considerations of the soil type, the herd size, other available feed, method of feed out. So again, this will be something that each producer will have to look at themselves. And also, probably most importantly, is looking at the cost of production. So again, what is it costing to grow, to manage these crops, to feed them out, relative to other available feed sources that could be used for the herd. So we've looked at intercropping in the last couple of years. I've been fortunate to work with plant scientist Dr. Vaughan Lawley here at the U of M and also with research groups across Western Canada. And intercropping is something that that we have looked at in a number of different capacities, a lot of time with corn, but also in the last year or so with cereals and brassicas and annual grasses. In nature, plants rarely grow alone. So when we think about intercropping, it is not really something that's very new. In agricultural production, the growing practice of growing two or more crops together in the same field is a fairly ancient practice, but we are seeing renewed interest in the use of this in this practice. One of the things that we want to look at, though, is can we use intercropping to address a need for high quality and high yielding feed for grazing? So sometimes these are not mutually don't happen at the same time, but we want to try and find that balance where we want to provide adequate feed, but also of adequate quality. So that is where, when we start talking about feed testing, it's very, very important because you don't know what's there until you do a feed test. So as I say to my students in class every day, and they probably get fed up of me talking about it, feed test, feed test, feed test. So in order to optimize intercropping systems, we do have to have a better understanding of how these combinations of crops grow together, their complementarity, the impacts of nutrient availability, environmental factors, so soil type, weather, et cetera, and see, are there ways that we can manage them agronomically or from a grazing perspective to be able to utilize them as an option. And that is really what we want to try and get at, is to provide an option for producers that may potentially work for them in their system. And when we think about intercropping, is there some insurance policy, biologically speaking? So if we have multiple crops or forages, is there an opportunity if one fails due to weather or pest infestation, can the others pick up the slack? So we really wanted to be able to try and address this question. Again, kind of mentioned some of these, but are things to think about: the complementarity of the mix, soil and climate conditions, and the suitability of the forages for the soil type. Where we are here in the Red River Valley, we have heavy clay, and it's not necessarily going to be the same forages and crops that work here compared to if we're somewhere sandy like Brandon, for example. Thinking about the agronomy, are we seeding within or between rows? Is it better to plant crops in separate rows or multiple crops in the same row? Or does the answer depend on the situation? How close or how dense should the plants be? Seeding rate, seeding depth. That depth becomes a little bit challenging when you have different seed types. But again, is your seeder, or do you have seeding mechanism to be able to achieve different seeding depths? Fertility, again, that's a big question. Should producers apply fertility, and if so, how much? Weed control. So weed control is something that I do hear a lot from folks in how do we manage weeds. And again, having a really clean seed bed and trying to pick forages that are fairly competitive that can compete against weeds, because for some of these multi-species or intercropping, there can be limited in-season herbicide. Metabolic disorders, I'll maybe touch on that a little bit later, but again, I really don't have this is going to work for everybody in terms of one or two strategies, because all of these factors will differ depending on where you are and what your environment is. So it's important just to be thinking about each one of those and how can they be managed to achieve the best outcome. I'll talk a little bit for the next 15 minutes maybe on some of the corn intercropping work that we have done over here in the last couple of years. Corn grazing is utilized, probably not to a really, really huge amount because corn is an expensive crop, but there are benefits to it. So everybody will know corn yields a large volume of feed per acre or per hectare. So with a small land base, it is a means to produce a lot of feed. It provides an effective breakthrough cold weather and a very abundant source of energy. So very high in starch, very high in energy. So again, offers many benefits. Limitations, low crude proteins. So that's one of the challenges with corn grazing is its protein concentration ranges 7, 8, 9%. So that will potentially not meet the needs for sure of growing cattle, but even mature cows when it gets to be extremely cold. And it is a relatively high cost compared to other methods. So that's why things like your cost of production analysis, being able to cost out what it's going to, what the expenses are that are going to be able to give you the best idea on whether it's going to work for your operation. But in our project, we wanted to address the protein issues. So again, you can offer supplementary protein through the provision of hay, for example, but we wanted to see if we could grow the protein between the rows. We started this work several years ago. We did a 1 year proof of concept study where we had 2 sites in Manitoba where we grew corn on 30-inch rows and intercropped Italian rye, red clover, hairy vetch, grazing radish, and a four-way mix. And here you can see my collaborator, Dr. Vaughan Lawley, at one of our sites. So it did show early promise. High crude protein, anywhere from 13 to 30% crude protein. So we knew that we had the feed value there, but what was a challenge was the low yields. So we did have significant drought conditions that year. We had low intercrop and corn yields overall, but that 30-inch row spacing too narrow. So again, we wanted to see if we could open it up, go to a wider row spacing and allow more sun and more light and more water to that intercrop. So after that, we started a prairie wide. We had many sites across Western Canada. I think we had 4 in Manitoba, 1 in Saskatchewan, and 3 in Alberta. So we wanted to ask, can we establish intercrops with grazing corn across the prairies? Which of these intercrop species will perform well or are best adapted to different regions? And will intercropping provide adequate feed in terms of volume and quality for late fall or early winter grazing? So corn was seeded at early to end of May, depending on the site. And we went back and sampled all of these forages in late September and early November to get an estimate of their yield and their nutritive values. So I have a grad student who's just finishing up their thesis on this right now. I'll provide 1 or 2 slides. However, it was a very, very large thesis, so we'll just give really, really a snapshot. This is maybe a little bit of a busy slide, my apologies, but I wanted to pull something from local here in Manitoba. So a long season site at Carmen, and then just an example of Manning in Northern Alberta, a more short season to determine how these forages performed. So we had corn seeded on its own on 30 inches as sort of the standard control. And then we had corn seeded on 60 inches with intercrop in between. So the yellow bars, the yellow predominates, that is the corn yield. So we can see at all the sites, corn was the predominant producing forage. So we can see a lot of that there. But I don't know if I have a pointer here, maybe or maybe not. So the blue is the intercrops. So we did have a relatively small amount of intercrop produced at each site. We did this over 2 years or 3 years, my apologies. And we did see varying levels of precipitation. We saw varying levels of snow. We did see some challenges at some sites with flea beetles, for example. But depending on the site, and particularly in Carmen 2022, that we did see fairly good establishment of those intercrops. So we did see the presence of them between the rows. But one of the other interesting takeaways is we seeded the corn on 60 inches at half the seeding rate, but in a lot of cases we achieved 2/3 or so of the yield of the control. So even the intercrop benefited from the row space, but also the corn itself. So we seeded less corn, but got more yield of that. So just to give us an idea of where we able to establish it. When we looked at the quality, so again, this is just a very high level snapshot. We did see that these intercrops did provide the protein that we hoped that they might. Overall, the crimson clover tended to have the lowest crude protein of all of the forages that we tested. Um, Anywhere the others from 10 to 25%, the hairy vetch, the Italian rye, and the radish all being significantly higher in protein. So again, when we compared those options, trying to help us identify which might be potentially the most important ones. We also did look at the total digestible nutrients of these feeds. So all of them, the vetch, the rye, and the radish did distribute or did show high digestibility. One concern or consideration, I guess maybe is a better word, is nitrate toxicity. So when we utilize or potentially are interested in utilizing annual crops, we do have to be cognizant that some of these forages can be high in nitrates. So nitrate toxicity is something that can be fatal to cattle. We can adapt them to high nitrate feeds, but we did want to look at how often were these intercrop forages high in nitrates. So the legumes, the crimson clover, and the hairy vetch, they were considered within the safe range, no matter where and when we tested them. So again, nitrate safe. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the radish. So brassica species do tend to have high nitrates. So again, careful consideration of the rate of inclusion, the stage of maturity, would be important for when you're grazing brassica. And the Italian rye kind of fell intermediate, but nitrate concentration we did observe reduced over time. So the more mature or the later in the season that we sample them, the lower the nitrates. So I'll talk a bit more about nitrates later on. So I might just sort of very quickly. So again, this is a very large project, and it was tricky to pull in what were the overall objectives, but all the intercrops were able to establish with the corn, although drought did limit growth in some years in some locations. We did see variations in crude protein, but they were always higher than the corn, although the crimson clover tended to be the lowest overall. The nitrates, so again, something we just do want to be cautious about when we're grazing annuals. The radish overall what did exceed the acceptable level, so careful management of that would be required. We have seen though, we went to sample in September. Some years there wasn't great growth, and then we just get a wet fall, which we've happened to have for the last couple of years, and we really saw those intercrops take off after that fall moisture. So again, the potential to increase yield late in the season, even if we don't get a huge amount of rain earlier in the year. From the small plot study, we went on to do a grazing trial in 2023 at Glenlee. So here you can see, I think this was maybe our first day of turnouts. So lots of intercrop in between those corn rows, and talk a little bit about what we saw. Firstly, what did we do? We had three treatments. So we had corn only. So we had corn on a 30-inch row spacing. We had corn with Italian rye and hairy vetch. So we had 7 rows in between the 60-inch corn. And then we also had corn plus a radish and a fall rye. So we alternated the rows for that. So three treatments. We had some legume, we had grasses, we had brassica to really evaluate the range of feeds that could be potentially intercropped between the rows. So what did we do? The corn seeded fairly late relative to a silage or a grain corn. We seeded June 1st. The intercrop was seeded a few weeks later, on June 26th. That did allow us to be able to get a herbicide application in corn before we seeded that intercrop. We turned the cattle out on the 11th of October. So we used bred heifers for this particular study because, again, they are one of the classes of cattle that would benefit from this additional protein. We had a 2 week adaptation, and then we started our trial in mid-October and ended it in mid-December. So in this particular year, we had all the weather. We had lots of rain. We had lots of snow while the cattle were turned out on pasture. But as you can see here from this picture, they still were able to graze through the snow, even when it was deeper than this to get to the green that was underneath. So I will just present some of the forage data. Again, I just in the interest of time, and I'm probably running short on time already. I didn't have time to talk about all the things, but when we looked at the yields of the forages, so the yellow is the control. So this bar on the left here is the corn only. This middle bar here is the corn with the fall rye and the radish. And then the one on the right is the corn with the hairy vetch and Italian rye. So obviously we can see here that corn, just based on the sheer bulk of it, was the predominant forage that was present in the stand, but that we did have significant growth of the intercrops in between. But again, quite interestingly, we had half the corn seeded rate of the control, but that extra width did give it more opportunity to grow. So we did see yield benefits even for the corn on that 60-inch row spacing. This is a little bit busy. My apologies, but it just we sampled every 2 weeks from September until almost the end of November. So we have, measured our yield of the vetch, of the radish, of the Italian rye, and the fall rye. So we did see some increases in the Italian rye and the radish over time. So again, we had a fairly open and moisture plentiful fall. So we did see some of that continued growth that occurred over that 2 month period. Again, we had fairly mild temperatures in that period of time. We also looked at the yield of crude protein. So again, we wanted to be able to see how much, not just bulk feed, but how much crude protein. So that is where these high crude protein feeds allowed us to be able to demonstrate higher crude protein yield. So available crude protein for those cattle to graze over this period of time. So in both cases, these were higher than the corn only treatment, which is sort of what we were hoping to see. Looking at the protein concentration, so our fall rye and our radish were about 24% crude protein. Our hairy vetch and Italian rye was slightly higher. And as expected, our corn was low. So again, our corn crude protein was anywhere from about 5 to 7% at this particular site. So when we think about growing the protein between the rows, we were in this particular study in this site, you're able to do that. So the question then becomes, does that have a performance benefit? And in this particular study, it did. So we did see cattle gain about 2.5 pounds a day, approximately, for those grazing intercrop, compared to about 1.4 pounds a day when they were grazing the control. So even though the intercrop had a much lower yield, the cattle preferentially grazed it, and then we did see the performance benefits in this study. So again, hopefully my student will be able to finish writing this up this spring. We did also again look at nitrates. When we grazed the animals, or before we turned them out, we feed tested. So we did see that the radish had the highest crude protein, or sorry, the highest nitrate concentration of approximately 10%. So in this study, we chose not to graze those animals. Although the nitrate definitely did decrease over time, we don't especially know how much of a high nitrate feed they would eat to experience toxicity. So we didn't graze that. We did all the forage work, but we didn't graze that one. But we can see that, the hairy vetch was basically considered safe the entire time. The fall rye had very low nitrates, but we do need to be cognizant of high nitrates, particularly in those brassica, and to be able to monitor it over time and delay turnout if needed. So we did overlay this with the weather data as well, and as the temperature got colder, those nitrate concentrations tended to drop off. I did have a video here. I don't think it works, unfortunately, and probably don't have too much time to go over it. But again, this is in early November. Again, we'd had fairly decent snowfall, and those cattle were able to dig through it and preferentially graze that intercrop, and then go back afterwards and graze the corn. So apologies, the video doesn't work this morning. Um, can't really talk about this, but it is important to bring up because of the high cost of corn. It is important to really look at the economics of the whole system. So some work that we have ongoing right now is taking all the information from the grazing trial, from our small plot analysis across Western Canada to be able to look at the impact on producer returns of changing fall, winter, or grazing feed practices to incorporate corn or any annual forage, and looking at the risk and return trade-offs. So this is some work that's being done by our partners at the University of Alberta. They'll define representative cow-calf backgrounding operations and really assess the economics, assess the risk, and compare distributions of net annual returns about any of these systems, because it has to work on the dollars and cents. Otherwise, it's not going to work for your operation. But being able to compare the costs, but also the returns. So taking that animal performance data and yield data and being able to kind of look at a big picture or high level approach to that. So corn is one thing we're doing. We're also looking at other annual forages. This is a large project that's underway right now. We're kind of in the middle of it. And again, we have partners at the University of Saskatchewan, University of Guelph, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as well as here at the U of M. That's looking at assessing willingness to engage in integrated annual crop livestock arrangements between ranchers and producers, looking at a regional evaluation. Again, we want to be able to make region or climatic recommendations of what works in some places, what may not in others. We want to look at the impact of grazing on annual forage land soil health and subsequent crop productivity. Again, on all our projects, we want to look at the economic viability of annual crops for cattle grazing in the shoulder season. So again, there is potentially more land available through partnerships with cash crop growers. There is potential to increase nutrient and land use efficiency, maybe also to provide emergency feed. But again, we want to look at what this means to both the crop folks and also to the cattle folks. What are the barriers that exist around the utilization of these partnerships, and trying to best understand those. This is very fresh. We are just really looking at this data right now, but just to give people an idea, some of the things that we're looking at. Looking at small cereals, oats, barley, monocultures, low diversity mixes. Then we're looking at some high diversity mixes as well. One of the challenges when we have high diversity mixes of 8, 10, 12, 15 is, are all of those going to grow? Often they can be expensive seeds to purchase. So we want to really be able to look at, are there things that are just not going to be outcompeted every time? So again, really wanting to look at, are there particular combinations, particularly in that low to mid diversity range? Because when we get up to the very high diversities, it definitely becomes more challenging as to what's going to actually make it. We've looked at Japanese millet, forage soybeans, we have brassicas, we have legumes, we have grasses, forage peas. So again, looking at different combinations of grasses, legumes, and broadleafs at 8 sites across Canada. So that work is currently ongoing. Again, I borrowed one table. It's very busy, my apologies, where we took samples in we've been doing this small plot work for about 2 years now. So we took yield samples multiple times in the fall. We looked at quality, so protein, energy, nitrates, minerals. Really huge diversity depending on the site, depending on the moisture conditions. We've played around a little bit with altering the seeding dates, and again, sampling windows to try and target what would be the best time to utilize these. We have seen small yields, we've seen large yields, we've seen protein concentrations anywhere from 7 to 15%. Again, really will be driven by the window of when you want to graze those. So this is very busy. And again, my apologies, I've probably packed too much in for the purposes of 30 minutes. But if anybody has questions on this at the end, I'd be very happy to take them. Some of the considerations, just overall, whether it may not even be for corn intercropping, it could be for the utilization of swathed or silage. Again, I'll harp on like I do to my students all the time about the importance of feed testing. We have to know what's in that feed, particularly when we have challenges with drought. Um, Drought can exacerbate nitrates, for example, but we also want to know what the energy and protein are, because those are the two main things that we want to balance in the diet. So different options for feed tests, different labs, but it's a relatively cheap or inexpensive insurance policy to ensure that you are armed with the facts whenever you're developing your nutrients or your nutritional strategies. Supplementation. So again, we want to look at minerals. So some of these, like corn, we know is low in calcium. Are there other crops that are either low or high in specific minerals, and being able to really come up with a very effective mineral supplementation strategy, both all year round really, but particularly when we're feeding some of these annuals. Energy and protein, again, when we get into the nuts and bolts of balancing our diets, whether we're using something like cow bites or some other program, we want to ensure that we're not deficient in either of these for the stage of production or the class of animal. And if we are, what are the ways that we can supplement that? Is it other forages, grains, byproducts, et cetera, et cetera. Metabolic disorders, so acidosis, that's one thing, of course, we have to manage for when we're corn grazing. That high grain, high starch, again, preferential grazing for those cobs. So again, monitoring acidosis, not just in terms of the impact it could have today on those animals, but on things like abortion or causing laminitis, et cetera, et cetera. Nitrate toxicity, I think I'm going to talk about that on the next slide a little bit. The question I sometimes get is about potential toxicity of hairy vetch. So we had no issues with it in our grazing trial. We fed it successfully and we had no problems, but I have heard anecdotally some people that have had challenges. I think like any forage, it has to be managed. We don't know a huge amount about it, which is why I have a bit of a question mark here. There is some thoughts that it is the seed that is more of a challenge. So the stage of maturity at which it is grazed or utilized, the age of the cattle. But again, there's a lot that's unknown. But again, making sure that there's not a huge proportion of it in your stand would be something to consider. But a lot of unknowns. But we had no problems with it. Nitrate toxicity, again, talked a little bit about this. Things like brassica are particularly a challenge. And when we think about nitrates, again, getting your feed test, knowing what's out there. We can graze high nitrate feeds. However, it does require adaptation. So slow adaptation, ensuring cattle aren't hungry when they're turned out onto high nitrate feeds so that they could gorge it. Some considerations, the fertility in the soil N, so high soil N can contribute to nitrate accumulation. Nitrates taken up through the soil, from the soil through the plant roots, and is normally incorporated into the tissue. But we will see nitrate accumulate in the stalk or the stem when there's something that happens that interferes with normal plant processes. Again, frost can cause it, hail damage, spray drift, herbicide 2,4-D can disrupt some of these plant processes, which can result in temporary high nitrate concentrations. So, an awareness of these factors is important. Some plant diseases and insect predation can also impact nitrate accumulation. However, some sprays may cause a spike, but if you don't spray and you have a weed problem, then that's not really the answer either. So again, just trying to consider the facts and maybe it's delaying turnout because we can see from our research that nitrate levels decrease over time. Um, and monitoring for the symptoms. It is unfortunately something that can be fatal fairly quickly, but being aware of the symptoms, being able to monitor and to manage, and again, that really important slow adaptation to these annuals, particularly the brassica, but some things like Italian rye we've seen with moderate to high nitrate levels as well. Um, just, this won't be news to anybody. It'll be the same for perennials or annuals at production. So really the yields that we're going to get will vary with the weather, the climate, the site conditions. So again, important that when you're considering an option, is it going to work for me where I am? Because if I'm somewhere of high moisture, it may not work somewhere where it's really dry with sandy soils that potentially have more leaching. So again, looking at the research and the information that's coming out about what might be appropriate for my site. We can't control the weather. I think we'd all be rich if we could do that. But again, just thinking about, are there particular forages or crops that may do better in drier places versus areas with more moisture? Because we do know that fluctuations in moisture is just going to have a really big impact on what the productivity, which is what you can see here in this picture, which is some work from Gillian Baynard from AFC that the same time a year apart, almost double the yield difference because of low moisture. Weed control, it can be a challenge, especially when you get into diverse mixtures that are, don't have the same sort of weed tolerance. There can be limited in-crop herbicide options, and discussing your weed control practices with your agronomist or whoever you get herbicide from is probably going to be the best idea. But again, just having the cleanest crop that you can have, again, more yield and less challenges down the line when it comes to utilization. Just a couple of considerations for the corn and the grazing and the annual forages. Again, you want to weigh up the pros and cons of both because all systems will have pros and cons. Corn, potentially higher fertilizer and seed costs, may need specialized planting equipment if you don't already have it, possibly needing tillage passes the following year to manage residue or stubble. But when you think about that late fall winter grazing target, it can produce high volumes of feed of high energy density for that window. For annual forages, so small grains, brassicas, grasses, utilizes more standard seeding equipment, has maybe similar seed and fertilizer costs compared to grain crops. The grazing intensity will influence residue management and really thinking if it's a standing crop, that late summer fall grazing target. So of course, if you're going to swath it or you're going to silage it, that allows you additional options beyond that fall window. Just some things that I think of when we think about annual cropping for livestock. There is opportunity there. Of course, there's, whole insurance and policy that is also very important consideration. But from a more maybe practical perspective, considering the site, the soil, and the weather, we don't have control of all of those things, but we can potentially control what we see to possibly best suit that. What's the agronomy that's required for it? Most importantly, what is the cost of production? So again, it may give you really great feed, but if it is cost you $1 million, again, you're looking at your return on investment to make the most important decision. And consider starting small. So you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and do this with your whole farm. 20 acres or a small parcel of land just to see if it works. And if it doesn't work the first year, it doesn't necessarily mean it won't work again. So having patience to try things and to give it a go in small areas just to see what might work for you. So those are just kind of some thoughts for the day. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. And apologies, probably went, as my students say, I would talk a little bit quickly. So if there's anything that I went through quickly through, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was a really great presentation, and you and your students have been very busy. You've got a lot going on. Does does anyone have any questions there for Emma that they want to pop into the chat?
Kristen, would you like me to stop sharing my screen? Would that be, or would you like?
No, I mean, we can,
Okay,
for a second here, ask. I've got a quick question for you.
of course.
The heifers that were grazing the corn and the forage intercropping, what length of access or how many days did you give them of access to feed at a time before you would move them again?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So what we did probably we moved every day, which wouldn't really be something that logistically that easy necessarily for producers to do. I think there's more kind of more common to move every 2, 3, or 4 days. The challenge that we had and the reason we did that was we had really, really heavy rain at the start of the trial. So we tried to meter out daily so that it wouldn't be trampled because we're on very, very muddy, heavy clay soil. So once we started that, we had to keep going for the purposes of scientific consistency. But we did see that they still went for that intercrop first. We kind of thought, well, they grazed the corn, they like the taste of the cobs, they'll go for that first. But they went for the intercrop first and then came back later. But that probably isn't practical, but that's just because of the soil and the really wet. We had a really, really wet week. We had to do that. And once we started, we kind of had to keep going.
And was there any intercrop that you found that they seemed to prefer? Was there anything that they sort of needed to be given more time to adapt to and to be more willing to eat, or did they just go for it
In
with
this
all the different types?
In this particular study, they just went for it. So the mix that we grazed was the Italian rye and the hairy vetch, and the hairy vetch was not mature. It was vegetative. So that's again, we seeded it late because we didn't want it to mature too early. So in that trial, they ate everything. In another trial we just finished, we just did before Christmas. So I don't have any data to show for that, but we had a radish in there, and they ate the radish, but they ate it last.
Okay.
So we would go out, lift the fence in the morning. We had a millet, a soybean, Italian rye, and a radish mix. They'd eat everything, and then when you come back in the afternoon, that's when you'd see they would eat the radish. So they would eat it, but they ate it
Okay.
last. Yeah.
Okay.
But
I'm
I don't have data to show that. It's just what I
for
saw when
sure.
I was out
Yeah,
fencing every day.
anecdotal, and absolutely. I'm really looking forward to seeing the results on the recent work that you're doing with the different mixes of species and seeing what seems to, be the most competitive in the different mixes and also the nitrate levels
Yes.
with time. That I'm really, really looking forward to seeing because um, sometimes, we plant these different mixes and it looks beautiful, and then fall time comes and we have a nitrate issue, and those aren't
Yes.
fun to deal with. It just that little bit of extra worry. So that'll
Yeah,
be
and I think, you feed test, but the challenge is you might have to wait a week for the results of that feed test, right? So I think knowing the risk factors for high nitrates, if you have high soil in, if it's been a drought, if there's been insect, like all of these things would just be a catalog of, I won't say errors because they're not our fault, but they're just a perfect storm. But I think if you have delaying like we can graze high nitrate feeds. Like we've grazed radish last fall and it had high nitrates, but the adaptation is
yeah.
very important that they didn't get turned out the first day and just got to eat whatever they want. We sort of restricted them and supplemented them for the first few days. So it is possible to manage. The challenge with nitrate toxicity is that as you be aware, is that it's fatal fairly quickly. So that if you didn't see them for 24 hours after turnout, and it's fairly hard to treat.
Yeah.
So yes, we are definitely looking at that. I think there's some work as well that's being done in Saskatchewan that's looking at the impact of does ensiling high nitrate feeds bring down the nitrate concentration. And I think it's from some previous research, I've seen that it does have
Yeah.
some reductive capacity, but it's a sort of a band-aid. It's not going to bring it necessarily down to safe levels, so you just
Where
have
you
to,
need it. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I've seen some crazy high tests, above 1%. And you've got to kind of wonder if ensiling is going to be able to knock that down enough to be safe. Otherwise you're mixing it in with something else. But
Yeah.
thank you so much for your presentation. Are there any questions for Emma?
Yes, I do have actually a couple.
Okay.
First one, why were the cattle in the McIntyre trial not supplemented with protein? And would that explain the 1 pound difference in performance?
Yes, it was. So they were not supplemented because we wanted to see what corn on its own would do. So they all gained weight. But yes, because the intercrop itself was so high in protein, even though there wasn't a massive amount of it there, it was still enough to create that 1 pound difference. So you can't. We couldn't supplement because then we couldn't test what the control would be. But we monitored weight the whole way through, and if any had been losing weight, of course we would have stepped in, but they continued to gain weight all the time. So we had to be able to test the control without supplementary hay or something like that. But we did monitor them the whole time to make sure that they did continue to gain.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. And one more here. Any trials with chaff as a feed?
I have not done, and I don't think I'm aware, but of course I'm happy to be corrected. Um, it would be just very low quality, but again, would it be a filler feed in terms of if you're just stuck for feed or you have a drought? But I would say the fiber is really high and the protein and the energy. Well, the energy would depend on how effectively, I guess, it's been combined. But I'm not aware of it, but it's not to say it hasn't been done. But again, looking at the feed test would be the most important because it'll offer plenty of fiber and bulk potentially, but it won't necessarily offer the protein and the energy. So that'd have to be supplemented from somewhere else. But it's definitely something that, when feed supply is tight, you utilize what you can get.
Okay, great. That's all I have right now for Juanita. Did you want to add anything to that or you're good there? No.
I'm
Okay.
good, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you so
that's all
much.
the questions I have for now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. It was a fantastic presentation. I'm going to see if I can flip my slides over. I did it. Okay. Winning today. All right. So we are going to, oh, if I can get my slides to move. There we go. We're going to go to kind of a lightning round of our Chewing the Cud session. Does anyone have any questions out there that they'd like to pop into the chat for Juanita or myself? But I'm going to throw Juanita under the bus. So
That's fine. I mean,
that's
I'm
fine.
I'm I'm here to help. If there's a question you can't answer, no.
In case there aren't any, we like to pop a few up on the screen from of questions that we've received over the last couple of weeks from the last webinar session. Nothing yet? Okay, so and what we've been asked a few times actually, we've had some questions about some of the concerns associated with feeding sweet clover. And if there is some dicumarol in, some of those sweet clover hays that we are worried about where we can get that tested. So maybe we'll pop over onto those slides and we'll go over them quickly. So Sweet clover poisoning, it occurs when cattle consume sweet clover hay or silage that contains dicoumarol. And sweet clover naturally contains coumarin, which is harmless. However, when the sweet clover hay or silage becomes moldy during curing or storage, the molds convert the coumarin into dicoumarol, a toxic compound that interferes with vitamin K and prevents normal blood clotting. So wet haying seasons, baling hay too tough, or storing hay under damp conditions, it all increases the risk of mold growth and dicoumarol formation. The weathered outer layers of large round bales, these often contain the highest levels of dicoumarol. And once the dicoumarol is present, it doesn't break down over time. So our older bales remain risky. And during drought years and those with feed shortages, sometimes we find these older and lower quality feed being brought to the front of the pile, and we're using them in our rations. And at this point in time, then the risk for dicoumarol toxicity increases. Uh, Cattle must consume feed containing dicoumarol for usually several weeks before signs develop. All classes of cattle are susceptible, but calves, yearlings, and pregnant cows are at the highest risk. Dicoumarol can cross the placenta, affecting unborn calves and increasing the risk of abortions and stillbirths. So sweet clover poisoning often develops slowly, and it may become a herd problem, affecting 25 to 30% of the animals consuming the contaminated feed. And this is because spoilage often occurs in pockets within bales, stacks, or within silage, and some cattle may consume higher levels than others. The problem shows up as a bleeding disorder, and early signs may include stiffness, lameness, dullness, soft swellings under the skin, most commonly over the hips, brisket, and or neck, and this is due to blood pooling in these areas. Gums and eyelids may appear pale, due to anemia. As bleeding continues, cattle may show breathing difficulty, weakness, bloody manure or urine, blood and milk, and nosebleeds are also quite common. Calving may be accompanied by severe bleeding, and newborn calves may be weak or die suddenly from internal bleeding. Sweet clover can be a useful forage, but it must be managed carefully to reduce the risk of the dicoumarol toxicity. Some strategies for this, when establishing or renovating hayfields, consider selecting sweet clover varieties that are low in coumarin, as this reduces the potential for dicoumarol formation if spoilage does occur. Good harvest and storage practices are critical. So hay should only be baled once it is properly cured. Never bale tough or damp swaths. Wet hay greatly increases the risk of mold growth and dicoumarol formation during storage. Stored feed should be monitored regularly for signs of heating, mold, or spoilage. If mold is visible or hay smells musty, it should not be fed. While visibly moldy portions of hay or silage can be discarded, it's really important to recognize that dicoumarol may be present even when mold isn't obvious. And when in doubt, sweet clover feed should always be tested for dicoumarol prior to feeding. Avoid feeding sweet clover as the sole forage source for long periods. Alternating sweet clover hay or silage with other roughages such as grass, alfalfa, or grass legume mixtures can help reduce the risk of toxicity. A common approach is to feed sweet clover for 7 to 10 days, followed by an equal period on an alternative forage. This reduces the severity of poisoning, but it does not completely eliminate the risk. Sweet clover should not be fed to high-risk classes of cattle, including late gestation cows, cows that are close to calving, or cattle undergoing surgery, dehorning, branding, or other procedures where bleeding may occur. Sweet clover should be removed from the diet at least 4 weeks. Some folks will say 2 to 3, but I would really prefer to err on the side of caution, so 4 weeks prior to calving or any planned processing events. Okay, so now that I've properly freaked everyone out, which labs test for dicoumarol? You've got a couple of options. The first being Central Testing Laboratories Limited in Winnipeg. This is an outsourced test that will have to cross the border. The cost is approximately $178 plus shipping and brokerage, which will run you to about $100. Um, these prices are subject to change, so it's always best to check in with the lab about what the total cost will be. And a thing to note about sending the test to central testing is because it is outsourced, the turnaround time for test results is fairly lengthy. And so you need to budget around 20 business days before you're able to get a result. Central testing asks that the samples be sent to them in a large Ziploc style freezer bag, and any samples that are silage should be frozen just to maintain quality. And samples must be accompanied by a completed submission form, which you can find online at their website, which we've got at the top there. And so when you're filling it in, just right in this area here under test package, you want to make sure that you're indicating a dicoumarol test. And samples can be delivered in person. They're just located on Lagimortier in Winnipeg, or sent by courier, or shipped via Canada Post, Express Post. Okay. Our second laboratory is the University of Guelph Animal Health Laboratory. The AHL requires the sample to be at least 100 grams in size and, like central testing, stored in a Ziploc type freezer bag. If the sample is silage, again, you definitely want to freeze this to maintain quality. Note that the AHL does not provide services to the general public. So either your Manitoba Agriculture representative's name or your herd veterinarian's name will need to be in the clinic section of the ruminant submission form that is required to accompany each sample. And so that would just be, if I can get my mouse to work, just in this area here. So again, that would be your Manitoba Ag rep. Just give them a call, make sure they know that this is being sent in, or your herd vet. Shipping by courier early on the week is recommended. AHL tends to work quite a lot with Purolator, and the cost of the test through them is roughly $105, but definitely be sure to double check with them about that. Okay, I think we're gonna skip this one because we're running short on time. But if anyone is watching the webinar later, if they've got the recording, you can absolutely just take a peek at this slide. They're just some tips for managing cattle under prolonged extreme cold. The forecast is looking pretty good. I hope I didn't just jinx us for the next couple of weeks. So hopefully this isn't something that we need to worry too much about. Our next Stock Talk webinar is scheduled for February the 5th, same time, same place, your computer, 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. We're going to have a quick review of programming updates, followed by a presentation from Allison Sass, Manitoba Agriculture's ag meteorologist. She's going to do a quick spring-summer weather update for us. And then following that, we'll take a look at some of the Manitoba pasture forage and water survey results with yours truly. And then we'll round out the webinar with a Chewing the Cud session, where I will inevitably try to rope Juanita into participating again.
Yeah, I think I'm available that day. So I'll put it in my calendar. All good.
Thank you. Okay, so should you have any questions regarding programming, feed and water testing, ration formulation, or any other matters related to beef cattle production, please do not hesitate to contact the Manitoba Agriculture, Livestock, and Forage Extension staff that are listed on the slide. In closing, a huge thank you to Emma McHugh for her presentation on annual forages, to Anita Kopp for her expertise, and just being her support during the Chewing the Cud session, and to both Erin Dieterle and Laurie Forbes for their work behind the scenes that make this webinar possible. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.